Moving on, because I could probably rant all day about California, but I'll save you guys the time. I'm hoping maybe some of that realism that's striking in California right now might come to Chicago. I love Chicago, beautiful city, especially in the summer. It's a little cold now, but it's much more progressive than I assumed, and not always in the good ways. Like not all progressivism is bad, believe me, but I'm kind of hoping some of that common sense comes to Chicago as well. But moving on, I wanted to try to be quick. We'll see. I have issues with quickness sometimes here, but I want to quickly discuss a topic that we actually talked about on the old podcast over the summer because it's something that autocrats, especially in Russia, have utilized for generations, actually, mainly in Russia. But it's also what Steve Bannon utilized to help get Trump elected, and then Trump has kind of used it. It's relevant because I think right now it's being used in Russia in the Ukraine issue, and it's kind of sowing chaos in the West, making many leaders and pundits question what's happening or unsure of their own reality. And this is called the fire hose of falsehood. And it's a propaganda technique, in quotes here, in which a large number of messages are broadcast rapidly, repetitively, and continuously over multiple channels, mainly in news and social media. And there's no regard for the truth or consistency. My layman definition would be it's flooding the system with so much shit that no one knows what is true or false anymore. And, it's just bam, 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 bam. Yes, no, right, left. Lies, lies, one truth here or there, and people just get confused. And ultimately, when a bunch of garbage information is flooding the media cycle or social media over years and years, the populace ends up kind of giving up on knowing the truth and they become just kind of a complacent population. And that's actually really what's happened in Russia in a lot of ways. Is I think a lot of the population doesn't like Putin, like his numbers are definitely going down. But when there's so much disinformation constantly thrown at you, you don't really care anymore, which is kind of depressing. And this information technique, warfare technique would be the better way to put it, according to the RAND Corporation, is marked by quotes here high numbers of channels and messages and a shameless willingness to disseminate partial truths or outright fictions. Basically, the bullshit information confuses people, causes chaos. I'm not going to get into this side of it today, but now Trump has done this with Bannon. It happened with COVID. I think that's why a lot of Americans believe the election was stolen because of just this constant disinformation that it's really hard to argue with someone who believes some of it. And so you just stop trying to argue with them. And it's kind of a societal issue where I think when this almost takes over your system, it's hard to have a healthy democracy anymore. But I don't want to talk about the domestic side of it today because it's more important in Russia for the context of what I'm discussing here. But the post-Soviet Russians, mainly under Putin, have used it. And I've seen, yeah, I've seen other people mention that it floods the system, like I said, with half-truths sometimes. And sometimes you do throw in a true truth. I don't think that's a word, but you know what I mean. And basically what this one article says here is that a skilled propagandist may salt the mix with statements that are partially valid. So you can go back and say, no, it's not all false. Look, we have this here. And the first time I kind of heard about this in a historical lens was actually involving Ukraine, ironically, about 100 years ago. I read a book called Red Famine by Anne Applebaum, who is, I've said it before, one of the best authors in the world, in my opinion. And basically, in the Lenin era, Bolshevik collectivism was using Ukraine as a breadbasket, stealing grain, and bringing it to Moscow. Over time, this led to a famine that killed a lot of Ukrainians. But Lenin used one of his comrades, and he sent him to Ukraine to basically sow chaos to get the resources for Russia. Because Ukraine, from what I've gathered, was kind of where the Soviet Union got most of their bread, grain, etc. And this ally of Lenin, whose name's left my mind at this point, he decided not to use force, but instead to create a hierarchy of farmers, and he wanted to turn them against each other. They kind of created a false class system that put poor farmers against wealthier but still poor farmers and made them point fingers. There were these false divisive narratives coming out of Russia, contradictory information. And over time, there was resentment between I would say, sorry, bus going by here. that there was kind of this resentment that it fueled, all this information coming in and out of Russia, and it was basically causing resentment between the middle class and the poor. Not the elites, but the middle class and the poor, and this allowed the poor farmers to end up picking up arms against the wealthier ones and seizing grain and doing the bidding for the Russians, while the Russians never really had to do much inside of Ukraine. If that sounds familiar, it's because it's definitely a strategy that we've seen again. In Crimea, right, the Russian annexation of Crimea, or whatever you want to call it. I forgot when it started, but I think it was, 2014, 2013? Essentially, Russia promised not to invade Crimea, but they definitely were there. And when confronted about it, Putin would basically deny that there were Russians there. He would blame foreign provocateurs, then Europeans, then Ukrainian extremists. The story was always changing. There was always some narrative, but it was never Russia. What made the event even more fascinating, though, was that eventually Putin then asserted, of course we had servicemen there. So at first he's like, no, it was Europeans, false flag, Ukrainians. And then eventually he's like, yeah, no, it was us. And he said they were acting very correctly. And basically what he did here was make everyone question their own reality, question how to respond, question who was even there. And by doing this, he was actually successful because he had time to do something, while the rest of us were unsure about what was true or false. And Putin did this again after the Russian agents poisoned that Sergei Skripal, I believe is how you pronounce it, and his daughter in Britain in 2018 with that nerve agent, right? And the Kremlin-controlled media blamed Britain at first. Then it was Ukraine, or Ukraine. And then it was an accident, or it was a suicide, or it was a revenge killing by relatives. But Russia didn't produce the agent. Or an entirely different nerve agent was used by Russia. And this has happened again with Alexei Navalny recently when he was poisoned. Of course, I truly would believe that most of the West knew it was Russia, but the Russian people probably didn't because of this narrative, and it does spread because I'm sure there's people in other countries, especially more people that might align with some of Putin's values, that are like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. And it's just misguided intelligence around this. And Putin's been doing this for years, and it's really been effective, I think, for his leadership because, like I said, all these lies build up and people just kind of give up on trying to disseminate them. And it's kind of, I think it was Gary Kasparov who was talking about this in that same episode I mentioned earlier in San Francisco, where it's kind of a really complicated game of 4D chess, where the rest of the world is trying to play by specific rules and an international order. And he's playing some 4D chess that's really complicated, and it kind of breaks the norms of how we're supposed to run the world order here. And it's useful for Putin because he can control the population and kind of control the foreign narrative, which now we're seeing him do with Ukraine. And democracy, for example, needs hope. It needs an active population who wants to vote and be involved. And if people give up on knowing what is true, it's easy to erode that. And I think outside of Russia, he's starting to use it to gaslight NATO, for example, about this conflict in Ukraine. He has gaslighted Ukrainians about it. And now he's just kind of sitting back and waiting for something to happen. I mentioned at the top of the show in the intro that Putin is basically waiting for someone else to attack so that he can justify a response. And I think he's primed the pump for war using this fire hose of falsehood. He's fire hosing the system. If you watch different media heads in the US or the UK, from Fox News all the way to MSNBC, no one knows what to believe. Some say conflict is imminent, others say it's hype. And this, I truly believe, is a strategy that's working on Putin's side. He has all the NATO countries basically arguing with each other on what to do because no one knows what to believe. And Vox, of all publications, has a really good article that goes over some of these falsehoods about Ukraine that Putin's been spewing, basically. And one example is that Putin pretends Russia and Ukraine are historically one people, and that they must be unified again, and that the Ukrainians want to be unified. Now, you could say in the Donbas region, there are some Ukrainians that align with Russia. I've read about Ukrainians that believe they're Russian. Yes, it's a complicated history, but it is not true that all of Ukraine wants to be part of Russia. The majority of Ukraine seems to want to go more westward in terms of their alliances and what their values are. But for Putin, basically lying and saying that all Ukrainians want to be part of Russia, that narrative gets into Ukraine. And there's also talks I've seen recently where Putin's like, how do you even know it's us who are going to invade? He's like, maybe it's the Polish. Maybe it's the Ukrainian rebels being funded by the CIA. You know, it's like then he's basically saying, like, we're not even there. What are you talking about? And I'm sure he'll change that story in a few weeks. Like, that's what he does. And then I saw in Politico that the Russians are also using digital propaganda inside of Ukraine to sow even more chaos. Politico notes that, in quotes here, the Russians and their proxies have used digital technology on the battlefield. Beyond the front lines, Russian efforts have knocked out government websites and spread damaging misinformation in towns and cities across the country. Digital warfare has threatened more of Ukrainian society than traditional munitions. The article goes on. If you bear with me for a moment here, some of Ukraine's most trafficked websites have alleged ties to the Kremlin and regularly print pro-Russian propaganda. Information and non-kinetic means of warfare are really changing the conflict's landscape, said Justin Sherman, a non-resident at the Atlantic Council's Cyber Statecraft Initiative. You've seen across the board, whether it's the Russians or U.S. intelligence, leaning into the fact that all these different tech mediums are a way to help achieve traditional battlefield ends. And I'm worried about this strategy because the thing is, if there was a conflict, and I think it's more likely there's not going to be a conflict. But if this strategy is causing Russians, Ukrainians, Western NATO countries to be walking on eggshells because of misinformed fears, could the pretext of war be almost based on a great effort to fire hose our systems? You know, and the worst thing is if Russia's using this cyber intelligence the way they are, if we did have a conflict, they would probably do it to us. And I don't think this country could handle that right now. So I think we need to be careful of everything Putin says because I think he's playing us, and it's working.